Hello, everybody. Good morning. Good morning in a variety of different ways to whoever's watching today. So the theme of my presentation is sign language variation and language attitudes across the Caribbean. So who am I? This is my sign name, Ian. People think it's because of my glasses, but that's not the case. When I was born, one of my eyes wasn't centered correctly. And then when I was 16, I had an operation to realign my eye. So that's why I was given that sign name. I'm a community researcher involved with SIL. They first came in 2007. And so they came to two islands, St. Vincent and Grenada. So that was my first experience. I've also been involved in Trinidad Sign Language, Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language Dictionary, and a variety of other projects now across the Caribbean. So I have visited much of the Caribbean, and I'll show pictures so you can have an idea of what that is. I'm a sign language teacher, and I teach Caribbean Sign Language interpreting and interpreter training based at the University of the West Indies, which is in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm also an interpreter and translator, and I'm the president of DEAF, DEAF, which is the Deaf Empowerment Advancement Foundation, DEAF. So this is the sign for Trinidad and Tobago. And we know that the steel drum bands are very famous globally. And that's where the sign Trinidad and Tobago comes from. The Tobago is because we're composed of two islands, and Tobago is a smaller island situated to the north of us. So that's why we have the sign that way. Our population is around 1.5 million people. Now you can see where I've carried out research across the Caribbean. So the first research I was involved in was in Trinidad and Tobago, looking at our sign language. Then I went to St. Vincent and Grenada and the Grenadines. And so this is the sign that we use. Grenada is this sign here, so a G on the back of the hand. This is the sign for the Cayman Islands, and then the Bay Islands. And they have been previously colonized by Honduras. So they are part of Honduras. Then we also see Providence and St. Andres. This is Providence. And St. Andres is signed like this. And they are territories of Colombia. And then Guyana. So this is where I've carried out research across the Caribbean, just to give you an idea of my background. In this picture, you can see the Cascade School for the Deaf. And it's important, if we're thinking about Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, where does it hail from? What's its etymology? A British person came to establish the Cascade School in 1949. That was the first education system for deaf people. Prior to that, in 1943, perhaps, there was another small school, to be fair. And then those pupils were transitioned into Cascade School, along with other students. So that's a school for the deaf. At that school, it was the oral method of education was used. So we had to use residual hearing. There was quite extensive hearing technology to try and help us to hear. We had to lip read and also learn to speak. If we used sign language at all, then our hands were hit and we were told to sit on our hands. So it was quite a staunch oral approach. For those who couldn't return home, there was a dormitory, and that's where we saw the emergence of Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language within the kids in the dormitory of the deaf school. And so we saw that sign language develop because of that.
In 1975, a person arrived. Their name was Peggy. They hailed from the United States of America. Upon their arrival into Trinidad and Tobago, they introduced sign language. They were using ASL. But at that time, there was a lot of SSE, signed exact English, SEE influence on ASL. So you had the English word order, my name, and a initialized sign for is, and that is the sign language that was introduced by Peggy. Most of the teachers were hearing at that school, and they didn't have any experience or knowledge of deaf culture, and really a lot of ASL and signed exact English was used. The Teachers Association was controlled by hearing people, and they were people were investigating this. So we don't have TTSL. There is no Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, and it was undocumented. We had the signs for frog, for movie, for forget, and for stupid, which you can see, these were here, we have these, they are Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. But research had not yet been done on documenting this. We look at ASL, where there's extensive amounts of resources available and much documentation, but that had not yet been happening in Trinidad and Tobago. In TTSL, in Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, this is the sign for school. And when you look at ASL, American Sign Language, this is the sign that is used for school. They are distinct from each other, these two signs. The man you see here, he comes from a family where there are 2 deaf children. And in school, as they were growing up, him and his current wife were using TTSL, Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. They gave birth to 2 children. And in the 1980s, these children learned ASL from their school that they were going to. So really, this person that you're seeing on the screen does have both a mix of Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language and ASL in their vocabulary. Looking at numerical incorporation, we see a variety of choices. On the top row, you see there, it's kind of the more old, these are older generations of people. They're probably approximately in their 70s. The second row of signers are approximately 40 to 60 years of age. And then in the bottom row, you see we have some younger signers, maybe up to their 30s. You can see quite a variation in their palm orientation, their hand shapes. So you see in the top row, the first one, they sign this with their palm facing them with this sign for 3. I think it's quite similar to BSL 3. And again, remember, the person who first originally came to and set up Cascade School for the Deaf was a British person. As we move down to the next generation, we have them with their palm facing their body with this hand shape for 3. And the younger generation, the third generation, have rotated the palm orientation to be facing outwards. So you do see that we have quite a variation in the signs here.
Shall I get coffee?
In the Caribbean, there has been a strong influence and propagation of ASL. That it's not that it's been completely colonized, but the people who have been in power and in control were often hearing people. The educators were hearing. So they might contact people for assistance, but we also had quite a few missionaries or churches or religious people. The people that came in and taught special education, all of these people came into the Caribbean, and ASL was disseminated. But as we look at the Caribbean, we have noticed that there are distinct and individual sign languages for a lot of these nations. Yes, they did, as these kind of colonization things happened and people came in using ASL, the national sign languages did decrease in popularity and in use, and ASL did grow in favor. But it is not true that Caribbean deaf people just use ASL. That is incorrect. There are many different Caribbean sign languages. For example, in my local area in Trinidad and Tobago, we even have variations, and we sign different things for the types of food that we have. We have cultural differences, and signs have developed that represent these specific differences, and they're only used in Trinidad and Tobago. We have different political systems, and our sign language reflects that. All of these different cultures do bleed into our sign languages, and we do have distinct variations amongst the Caribbean deaf signers. Here you can see all of these different ways that people sign Saturday. And now you can see some variations with the way that father is signed. And here's some variations with the sign for kind. It is important to recognize these sign variations and to document them across the Caribbean. And research is essential. We need to conduct it to identify and support these unique and distinct languages. People have the false assumption that a single sign language is used all over the Caribbean, just in the way that people assume that sign language is universal. When we look at spoken languages, we have innumerable dialects and languages that are used all over the world, and the same is what is happening in the Caribbean. Sorry, it's frozen. I'm going to try and progress through. Okay. Thank you. Now to move on to deaf-led organizations. In the past, it has often been hearing people who are running and managing and in control of these organizations. Now, deaf people have mobilized and are saying that we need to have deaf-led organizations. We need deaf educators. We need sign language. We need deaf tutors for sign language. When a hearing person is teaching sign language, they'll often speak at the same time, and people won't actually learn the signs. We need someone who's using who has a natural use of the language to be instructing in sign language. We need interpreters. And when deaf people go and look at these people signing, they say their face isn't clear. They don't have the right grammar. They're not using the right facial expressions, and you're not using the right mouthings. All of these things are essential aspects of sign language. When I was first involved in TTSL, the TTSL dictionary, we were collaborating with a lot of hearing people, but when we set up and we organized and we mobilized and we established DEAF, the Deaf Foundation. We hosted workshops on sign language vocabulary, specifically with Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. And the hearing people that were involved started to learn it. They got involved with the deaf community. Deaf researchers are also essential. They need to be out there collecting and documenting and gathering information on our sign languages. This is a government project focused on the TTSL dictionary. In the initial onset of this project, I was telling everybody, we have a distinct sign language, we have vocabulary, we have a lexicon. But we really needed to start documenting what we had in TTSL. And we created a visual dictionary that incorporated, yes, some signs from ASL that we use, but also documenting the TTSL signs. And we recorded videos, we documented it. It has not yet been published. It's not been put online yet. We are still in progress with this. But obviously, the Deaf Foundation is still looking for funds to progress this project further. Sorry, I was distracted. The US Embassy has provided some funds for our projects. And one idea that we had was to look at medical resources. It's essential to have these vocabulary documented and to have a project and filming of people signing in TTSL, different medical resources. And these will be put on a website. The reason for this is in most medical institutions like hospitals or doctors' offices, they might not know the sign for cancer, or there might not be one. And so they can access this website and be able to work with the deaf people that they're serving to show them the sign for cancer and to explain and have better communication within the medical system. The Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf sent 3 representatives to Trinidad and Tobago, 2 of which were hearing, 1 of which was deaf. And they provided trainings for our interpreters. And you can see that in the picture here. And these trainings were really important for the interpreters. And when they finished these workshops, they received a certificate to show what they had learned. And this was the first time in Trinidad and Tobago that we had a national budget day. We had 2 or 3 deaf people come. We had interpreters on the television. And it was really fantastic. This is an example from Grenada, apologies. And Here you have some documented signs for specific fruits and vegetables and plants. These are seen across the Caribbean, but the signs are not the same for these plants and vegetables and fruits across all of the Caribbean nations. The word is the same, but we have variation amongst our sign languages. The examples are here on the screen for you. So you can see here we have 3 different signs. The first one is for cassava. In Trinidad and Tobago, we sign it this way. In Trinidad and Tobago, we sign the second one, the golden apple, with this sign here. They're not the same across all of these nations. You have these vegetables or these fruits, and we have variation amongst all the Caribbean nations. But variation is essential. Hearing people think, oh, no, of course not. We should have a unified single sign language across all of these communities. But the research is important and it has shown us, and we need to support and document these variations. When we talk about documenting sign languages and creating sign language resources, it is absolutely essential. If there is no documentation undertaken and no record of these languages, suppose that there's an emergency or a political emergency, just like for the example of what happened with the coronavirus pandemic. If we don't document all of these sign languages and you just produce a single video or single bit of information in one sign language, it won't be accessible to the variations we have amongst our communities. It will become a real problem. If we document these languages and make these sign languages, make these resources, we can have real integration of the deaf and hearing communities. The interpreters will be able to match and align and be clear so that everything is accessible, and we can really develop to a more equitable future. When we look at documenting, there are many different ways to do this. You can be making GIFs, you can make videos. I'll show you an example here. You can see that there's a small boy. Comes from an Indigenous community, and he is in Guyana, and he knows Guyanan Sign Language. When he went to school, and he learned Guyana sign language from school, but also when he goes back to his home, he switches to sign in his more local deaf community sign language. So he's a bilingual small child in Guyana. This is looking at collaborative research in Providence Island. Here you can see them looking at the laptop. And it's an elicitation task that we undertook. And we were able to document multiple signs via one single prompt. And so it's just essential. This is one way that we are documenting our languages. You don't have to have these intense, robust, very rigid interviews. We ask for narratives. And through those narratives that we elicit from these community members, we're able to document these languages. You can see that there's someone there videotaping in the foreground. And also these people are training and learning how to use these technologies and these video equipments. And then over time, these will be tools and equipment that the communities can use themselves independently. So this is also a training opportunity for the research to empower the local communities to be involved in the documentation of their sign languages. Documentation is an ongoing task. In Trinidad and Tobago, we use this sign for 1,000, one with kind of a comma after it, which is different than the American Sign Language sign for 1,000. And more younger generations of people in Trinidad and Tobago are using this sign for 1,000. And then they gesture out, this is what I'm saying, it's 1000. So language is still evolving. And, we're not saying we don't want people to, we're not saying that's not, people can be like, oh, my sign's right and your sign's wrong. No, language is constantly evolving. And so documentation must be an ongoing process, not to eliminate signs that generations have used before, but to document them and to document their changes. Provides an ability for us to keep our history and treasure our history over time. So documentation is essential. And this is happening across all of the Caribbean nations. This is a way of us also preserving our heritage. You can see the goals here listed on the screen. And what we're looking to do is really connect the deaf communities and deaf sign language users across the Caribbean. Maybe there's a community that doesn't know how to set up an organization or how to get going with a project, and we can use our shared resources to support all of these communities across the Caribbean. We can provide them with research and training so that eventually these communities are able to develop independently and have the resources inherent within their own communities to progress. There's many different benefits and things that we can do to support our communities. So we're working on collaborating and fostering relationships between all of these communities. Being in a research team is essential. As we've said, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, but we have another researcher here from Puerto Rico and someone else from Jamaica, and it's essential that we work together. In the future, we hope to add additional researchers, maybe from Guyana, maybe from St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada. We're hoping to increase the size of our research partners so that we can collaborate with even greater efficiency across the Caribbean. Yes, my experience is from Trinidad and Tobago, but in the past, there were a lot of times when the people who were in the positions of power were hearing, and it was a bit difficult for me or others like me to stand up and fight for our rights and fight for the deaf community. But now we're working on not having dependencies on the hearing. We're working on gaining autonomy from all of these institutions and to have sign language be our natural human right and to progress with those rights. We have also universities working with us, iCAN, UCLAN, we also have UWI, which is the University of the West Indies. We have a variety of other program groups that want to work with us and collaborate with us and share in our interest and help us to move further with our goals. And this goal obviously is to enhance the lives of the deaf communities within the Caribbean through connectedness, through collaboration. Often you have these feelings from the Caribbean saying, looking at America, looking at Gallaudet University and thinking, oh, that's so great. I'll go there and I'll do that. But we need to take that knowledge and that documentation and that research and bring it to the Caribbean and really capitalize on our creativity and be, supporting each other in a bi-directional way. We need to grow our own deaf community and our own research from within the Caribbean and not always be looking to others and what they're doing as the ultimate goal, but really grow our own. Thank you so much for your attention. And I hope later, if you have any questions, if you're interested in it, or we look forward to your continued support in the development of deaf lives in the Caribbean. We want you to stay connected to us. Don't be afraid to do so. Stay connected ongoing. And I just want to thank you for your attention today.
So we have a question from Suzanne. I will turn the camera on. And Suzanne, if you can let us know which language that you're going to use, International Sign, British Sign Language, or you're going to speak.
I want to speak, please. Can I start?
I'm just trying to spotlight you, Suzanne.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I just start. You know, I'm from Germany. I'm a Creolist. I study Creole languages, spoken Creole languages, and that was extremely interesting in your talk. Many thanks for that. I was wondering whether there are also rural sign languages. So very local sign languages that you find in the Caribbean. I suspect that besides the more, official ones, let's put it like this, you have also, small pockets here and there where you get rural sign languages in small villages or whatever. Is that true?
I know within the Caribbean that we do have rural sign languages. So for example, in Guyana, they have a small group who use a local sign language. In Trinidad and Tobago, we haven't had much research, but I don't think so. Maybe if you have isolated deaf people, but in Guyana, they have rural local languages. Some of it may depend on the population size as well. Also, there are some very small islands in the Caribbean. So Province Island has its own sign language. Others, we don't know yet at the moment. We need to make sure that we do more research. But I'm sure that we would find across the Caribbean that there are rural sign languages, yes. And most of the languages we see maybe are Creoles, and we see influences from other sign languages across the Caribbean. So yeah, that's a well-made point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are 3 questions that have popped up in the chat. So I will go through them and I will sign them in BSL. So the first question is from Ellen, and she's interested in the project and specifically on the variation and how you identify the variation. And she asked, with regards to publications, have you published your findings? Have you published your results?
So I'm not great at writing English just because of the level of education that I received growing up. But I have video recordings, and I know that there are people who've done translations of that so that that work can be published. At my time, I was mainstreamed. There was no interpreter. So, my English isn't really a strong language for me, but we have a way of making sure that we can publish stuff for sure, yeah. And most of those I do I publish with Ben Braithwaite. I've published with some other people too. Within the University of the West Indies. Ben's a linguist, and there are other linguists as well. So you should be able to find publications on the work that we've done, yes.
Okay, and the next question from Liz. So with regards to do you have any plans to create any online dictionaries for the Caribbean sign languages that you've identified? Do you have plans for that?
That's a good question too. There are sign language dictionaries. I know not just for Trinidad and Tobago, but for other Caribbean islands as well. But one of the problems in terms of having an online resource is getting the money, the funding to be able to develop that resource. Funding is often tight. So we're still trying to look for funds and see who can support that. But it's money dependent. If we get the money, we'll publish things online. Yes, for sure.
Wonderful. And the third question is from Ulrika Zenchen. Ulrika said it's very interesting work within the Caribbean, and thank you for presenting. A question that I have is that with regards to deaf schools within the Caribbean, is the sign language being used more now as a result of that? What is the situation at the minute?
So, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, we do have signing within the education system, but across the Caribbean, it really depends. We know that the number of deaf people are quite small, across different Caribbean islands. Typically, when children are born, they have access to audiological services. And so oral methods are preferred and cochlear implantation. But we don't have a full picture of what's happening across the education system.
Wonderful. And the final question for now is sign Kevin. I don't know your name. So sign language in the Caribbean, is there any slang at all?
I mean, there must be some, but we haven't got much research on that. Obviously, there's much more research on slang for hearing people in spoken languages. Sometimes we have words which don't have a translation. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we have this sign, which is kind of like looking a person up and down. But I don't know whether it's slang or more a code potentially. Or sometimes these things are expressed just without a manual sign, but expressed perhaps, as I just showed you, kind of like pursing the lips and moving your head to the side, and then that's understood as a code. So rather than slang, maybe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian. So I think now we'll have an eye break. Be a good time to go for a break. And I think it's a perfect opportunity for you to go for a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, go to the toilet, whatever you need to do. And we'll say thank you, Ian, for your presentation and the many comments that are coming through. You can see that people are saying, wonderful, we really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
I think we'll go for a break and then we'll have a presentation from Yarat. So for now, we'll have a 10-minute break and then we'll come back at 11 o'clock.